The Forked Ways. Chapter 11. A Place in the Forest. Come on, quickly, but be careful. Mark Forrester swiftly descended the trail, and Fletch followed him into the cleft. When they reached the bottom, they found Silver lying in a pile of leaves. One side of his face was scraped and bloody, the other side drained of color, but he was alive. "It's gone, whatever it was," he managed. "Reckon I must have scared it off on the way down." Mark knelt by him. "Your face is scratched pretty badly. How does the rest of you feel?" "Right ankle hurts. I tried standing, but it didn't work. Other than that, there's not much pain." Mark took out a pocket knife and deftly slit the leg of Silver's jeans. "Can't see much in this light," he muttered, "but it doesn't look too bad." He frowned and looked at Fletch. "We really ought to have an ambulance, but there's no way, not out here. I'll bring the truck up the hill as far as I can. We'll lift Silver into the back and take him to Doc's. We can call Liz from there." As soon as his father left to get the truck, Fletch moved close beside Silver. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I would never, never hurt you on purpose." "I know that, you goofball. What did you see down here? What did it look like?" "I just saw the eyes, thin green ovals, but really big. And then something like the tide, like a black cloud, only I didn't really see it. Everything turned red. Did you see anything?" Silver shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. It happened too quickly." He straightened up and expelled a sharp, pained breath. His tattered shirt fell open, and even in the failing light, Fletch could see the skin of his right side had been horribly snagged and torn. "That looks pretty bad," he whispered. "Hurts, too," Silver admitted. "I've just noticed." He tried to bend and look, but Fletch quickly put a hand against his shoulder. "I really wouldn't do that. You might go into shock for all I know." Silver grimaced. "That bad? See any ribs?" "Only one or two," Fletch said vaguely, trying to force a smile. He was telling the truth. His father brought the truck nearly to the rock. He lifted Silver easily and carried him down the hill. Fletch climbed into the bed of the truck, and during the long, rough ride, he cradled Silver's head in his lap. The wind whipped his hair like a scourge of cords, and he didn't try to talk. Silver kept his eyes closed the whole way. His face was ashen. Terrified that he might die, Fletch silently began a chaotic, almost wordless prayer of anguish to a God in whom he scarcely believed. He smoothed Silver's hair and tried not to look at the spreading stain of blood that soaked his shirt. It was dark by the time they reached the mill. Callie and Doc both answered the door, and Doc came swiftly over and swung himself up into the bed of the truck. His face, usually so merry, was drawn with seriousness. "Got some trash in there, my boy. Leaves, dirt. I can clean you up at the office and do some x-rays, see if we need to send you over to Winder Barrow." He glanced at Mark. "Drive him on up to the office. I've got a stretcher there. We can get him out easy." He gave Fletch a comforting smile. "You climb back up and keep him from running off. I'll meet you up the street in 5 minutes." Doc Merritt's office smelled of alcohol, roses, and old leather. Glass-fronted cabinets held bottles of the herbal remedies Doc called his nostrums. There were wooden drawers with handwritten labels containing a wide assortment of dried plants, and shelves holding small canisters of medicinal powders. He also had displays of antique surgical equipment, instruments that always made Fletch glad he hadn't yet been born before the days of effective anesthesia. Apart from the bone saws and cautery irons, the office reflected Doc's calm, good-hearted reassurance. 10 minutes after his father's telephone call, Elizabeth Kendall arrived at the office. Mark told her that Silver had fallen while trying to help Fletch, but wasted no time on a full explanation. He offered to wait until they were sure of Silver's condition, but she sent them home, promising to telephone before midnight. There was only a single streetlight in assembly. and as they left Doc Merritt's office, only a glow from the windows illuminated the sidewalk. They left Silver's truck on Rowan Street and walked home through the common garden, guided only by moonlight and the distant lights of the pastorium. The scent of tomato vines lingered along the path, and off beyond the highway Fletch could hear the clank and clatter of a slowly passing train. Tears sprang into his eyes, and he was glad his father couldn't see his face in the dark. "He'll be all right, I'm sure." His father slipped an arm around his shoulder. "Why don't you tell me about the wolf?" he said softly. Reluctantly, Fletch began talking about his dreams, and tried to explain a little about the tide. Mark listened without speaking as they passed through the garden gate and turned up the drive toward the house. The wind had picked up. "It makes me feel like I'm trapped in my body," Fletch finished. "Ever since the accident, I can't keep anything at a distance, can't escape. The wolf knows that. He knows how to suck all my breath away." "I'm no authority on devils," his father said at last, "but I'm familiar with their work. The tide sounds like some kind of panic disorder. Your mother used to have trouble like that around the time I met her. The wolf may be an evil spirit, as everyone around here seems to think, or it may be an image your mind is using to represent things you fear. Either way, you don't have to face it by yourself." He thought for a minute. "What does Silver have to say about it?" "He thinks it's real, that it's some kind of ancient creature which lives in the swamp. I think that's why his grandparents started coming here in the first place. Bill and Betsy called them down to try to get rid of it. Silver gave me something called remade tobacco for the tide. I had it with me today, but I didn't have the chance to use it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Well, keep it handy. Tomorrow I'm going to call Dr. Stevenson in Atlanta and make an appointment for you. She'll be able to judge whether you need to get back on your meds for a while. In the meantime, I think you and Silver are both in need of intercessory prayer. I'll probably also need to talk with Betsy." Silver's mother called about an hour later, and Mark talked with her. Silver would be in bed for a few days, but amazingly he'd broken no bones in the fall. Doc Merritt was optimistic. The next day Fletch could have visited him, but he felt too sick to go. What if he had an attack while he was there? He might see the wolf keeping vigil beside Silver's bed, its jaws glinting with grinning rows of surgical needles. Often during the day he caught himself clasping his side, trying to hold in something which had already irretrievably flown. When his father telephoned Dr. Stevenson, he found she was on a trip to Zurich and wouldn't return until the end of the month. Fletch trusted her, but didn't want to speak about what was happening with anyone else, so his father reluctantly agreed to let him wait until she returned. Early the next morning, the wolf came to visit. A chilling mist had crept into Fletch's room through the open window, and he got up to close it, looking out across the cemetery toward the church. The mist crawled about the stones, and as it briefly cleared, he caught sight of a monstrous hulking beast which had torn open several of the graves and was devouring the corpses. The wolf looked up toward Fletch's window and padded over. It stood up on its hind legs and became more man than animal. It searched among the folds of its long fur coat and found a silver cigarette case. The wolf popped open the case, snagged a cigarette between its lips, and lit it, all in one fluid motion. "Nothing like lucky." Its voice was rough, but deep and resonant. "Have a smoke?" "No, thank you." The wolf shrugged and made the silver case vanish as deftly as a stage magician. "What were you thinking, little pig?" it asked, almost without inflection. "You were thinking it was all wrapped up. Cuddle up close with the Indian boy and the wicked old wolf stays home. Well, he's not here to help. I've stripped the skin right off his bones. You've got no mommy to protect you now. You've got no Cherokee boy." The wolf's eyes glittered. "You've tasted his sweet flesh. You're hungry for it still." "I hate you," Fletch whispered. I've never hated anything before like I hate you." The wolf looked pleased. "Your soul belongs to me," it said. "You're a fool to try and put it off. Why don't you come and have a drink at the well?" Fletch slammed the window down. In school that day, he felt like a creature made of straw, tossed from room to room by a shifting river of people, sodden and drowning, but not caring. In geometry, Mr. Barfield droned on about coefficients, and he began to realize that he had no memory of what a coefficient was. The meaning of the term had vanished. René Duran caught his eye and shot him an inquiring glance, but he only shook his head. Feeling trapped and breathless, he clenched his hands and closed his eyes, but all he could see was the ragged wound in Silver's side, the dreadful white of his ribs. Fletch knew that there was no way he could make it to the end of the period. Ordinarily, he would never have had the nerve to walk out of class without permission, but he got up with hardly a thought. Mr. Barfield called his name as he went into the hall. A moment later, Fletch heard the quick, purposeful tread of the man's shoes on the tiles, and felt his heavy hand grip his shoulder. "Just what do you think you're doing, getting up and walking out of my classroom?" Fletch looked up at him, not feeling afraid or angry or guilty or anything he would have expected to feel. Mr. Barfield looked a little unsure. "Are you ill? If that's the case, you should have asked for an infirmary pass." His grip was painful, and Fletch shrugged from beneath his hand. "I've got to go outside," he explained. "I'd rather not hurt anyone." Though Fletch had not meant the statement as a threat, that was the way Mr. Barfield took it. He spun around and headed straight for Mr. Sellers' office, and Fletch fled through the exit doors into the compassionate September air. He knew he could vanish and they would never be able to find him, but there would be the problem of getting home. He sat down near the breezeway, leaning against the warm side of the building and hoping for at least a few minutes of peace before he was caught. He slipped one of Silver's wildflowers from between the pages of his math book. Limitless pain spread through him, and he felt sure his heart would break before it eased. Not far away, bordered by a few ragged shrubs, lay an area where students could smoke on breaks between classes. On top of one of the benches, a chipmunk sat among heaps of acorns, ready to bolt. Watching it, Fletch knew what he had to do. He would leave, pack a tent, and go deep into the woods, leaving everyone else safely behind. There he could face the wolf without endangering the people he cared about. Fletch pressed his fingers into the dust, drew strength and conviction from the warmth of the wall against his back. The metal door opened around the corner of the building. There was no mistaking the clank of the bar being pushed down, the protest of the painted hinges, but he could tell that the door had been opened without violence or distress. Mr. Sellers came around the corner. The principal's grave expression lightened when he saw that Fletch was still there. "Ah, there you are. Glad to see you decided to hang around. Mr. Barfield told me you had flown the coop." He came over to where Fletch was sitting and squatted on his heels. "What's all this about threats and leaving the classroom?" "I did leave," Fletch admitted, "but I never threatened him. I was trying to explain why I had to get away." "And why was that?" "I'd rather not talk about it." Mr. Sellers was silent for a while. He picked up a leaf and twirled it between his thumb and forefinger. "I know that you and Silver have grown very close, and I understand how worried you must be about him. Is that what's troubling you?" "That's part of it," Fletch admitted, glad to be able to give an easy answer. "Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? To me, or maybe Miss Ahumada? That's part of what we're here for, not to judge your feelings, but to help you deal with them." "I don't need a counselor," Fletch told him wearily, "unless you happen to be a witch doctor or the agent of the Most High." The principal chuckled. "I'm not much of either, I'm afraid, but I'm willing to try my hand at it if you'll let me." "I just need to be alone. That helps for some reason. I'll come back for next period, I promise." Mr. Sellers considered this. At last he got up and looked down at Fletch kindly. "Okay." Fletch looked up at the word, meeting his gaze, and realized that the man was speaking to him not as a student with problems, but as a fellow human being. "You're almost one of us," Fletch thought. "Doc and Betsy and the folks at Assembly. Whatever we are, you're like that too." When he got home from school, his father was out, so Fletch took the opportunity to get the camping gear together. He strapped a tent to the frame of a backpack, along with a sleeping bag. Inside the pack he put a mess kit, a few packages of food, and a canteen of water, together with an assortment of supplies he thought necessary or useful, including Silver's wildflowers and the last few scraps of the remade tobacco he had given him. Then he lugged the pack out to the barn and hid it. From the door of the barn he could see uphill to the old well in the orchard, and downhill to the edge of the lake. And behind him there was no sound, no odor, no change in temperature, nothing that Fletch could attach to any sensory impression, but the certainty that something stood behind him in the darkness was unmistakable. He turned and saw nothing but the section of rotted flooring where he had replaced the sickle the morning he had found it. If anything belonged to the wolf, the sickle did. If anything could summon it, the sickle could. In the dim light he found the hiding place and opened it, reached in and closed his fingers around the wooden handle, drew the old tool from the rotten sack which held it. He hooked it in his belt and returned to the house. Later in the evening, Fletch took the sickle into the yellow room. He lit an oil lamp and seated himself by the window. Using fine sandpaper, he cleaned the rust from the blade, then wiped it down with an oily rag. Finally, he placed the tool on the round table, turned down the lamp, and waited. The ghost of Jarrett Harper did not appear. Sleep was fitful that night, but at least there were no wolf dreams. At 5:30 he got up and listened to the house. His father usually slept for another hour, and by then he would be on his way. He made a cup of coffee and set a brief letter to his father beside the coffee jar. It was written in his best conversational tone, stating that he needed to get away for a while, that school was no problem to make up, and that he had taken the camping gear and a few days' worth of supplies. The letter made it plain that he intended to be back in a day or two. At 6 o'clock, he put on his jacket and went outside. The air was cool and still, but damp, and he felt a strong inclination to turn back. It took effort to circle the house and go down to the barn. Fletch retrieved his pack, took it to the boat, and heaved it in. Mist curled and circled over the lake, rising like troops of wraiths into the warming air. He could barely see the other side, a flat blue-gray shadow of trees over which the sky had paled with dawn. He first thought to set up camp in the clearing, but if his father or the others did happen to come looking for him, that was sure to be one of the first places they would look. He needed some place hidden, but not too far from there. Upon reaching the shore, he pulled the boat away from the bank and into the undergrowth. The pack was heavy, and when he struggled into it he felt like a turtle trying to walk upright. It was a long, rough track to the labyrinth. By the time he reached the stand of hawthorns, he was exhausted. He left the pack and scouted the woods near the maze entrance, coming upon a narrow deer trail which divided at the edge of a stony gully. One trail continued along the rim. The other plunged down into the darker regions of the forest. After some hesitation, he chose the gully, determined to confront the depths and shadows. Beyond the gully, Fletch found a broad area of higher ground with little undergrowth. It looked favorable. Just to be sure, he sat down on the pine needles and closed his eyes. The place felt good, secluded yet warmed by the sun. He heard the rush of wind, smelled the wealth of greenery and decay. He could sense no animosity here, no rebuke of his presence. The woods accepted him and required nothing of him. It didn't take long to set up camp. Soon he had the tent staked down and the aluminum support poles in place. There was enough room inside for his sleeping bag and backpack, but not much else. This was merely Spartan shelter. Home was the forest. Hills and gullies were his rooms, and the clearing would be his private chapel. He spent the morning roaming aimlessly in the woods, trying to convince himself that he had made the right decision. Though he had challenged the wolf to a duel, he wouldn't be surprised if it didn't show up at all. Fletch could wait out here a week, then give up and go home, and find the wolf waiting by the back door when he got there. If the wolf did decide to visit the camp, it would probably be after dark, so Fletch had the entire day to worry about it. After a tasteless lunch, he decided that what he needed was fortitude, and the best place to get it was the clearing. In spite of the dawn chill, the day had grown hot. Jays hurled insults from the branches. He decided to try and thread the labyrinth blindfolded, to see if he could accomplish the feat alone, and he took off his t-shirt and bound it around his eyes. Only by relaxing and letting go of his worry could he sense the turns of the path. The easiest way was to let his mind drift, to meet each thought as it came and leave it behind. He was aware of the rhythm of his feet against the earth, but before long that seemed to separate itself from him, as if he were sitting apart and observing the footsteps of someone else. Eventually the rhythm faded into the distance. Some time passed before it occurred to him that, though he was still moving, he was no longer standing up. A roaring sound echoed around him, rising and falling, and he noticed an odor which he couldn't quite identify, though it seemed familiar and vaguely troubling. Warily, he pushed up the t-shirt and looked out. He was completely unprepared for what he saw. Between Heaven and Hell. Doc Merritt sat at the small kitchen table in the Kendalls' cabin, along with Elizabeth and Betsy. He had stopped by to examine Silver's wounds and was relieved to find that they were healing. Silver slept now, relatively free of pain. Doc sipped the steaming cup of strong black tea that Liz had poured for him, and cut a wedge of cheese from the block. "So, the old wog is out and about again, from what Silver tells me," he said. "You know Cap has been losing cattle to some kind of predator." "Silver has the idea he can fight it off with Cherokee magic," Liz told him. "Fletch is determined to help him, and Betsy seems to think they may actually be able to do it." Doc grinned. He remembered Silver at 11, his hair flying, launching his bike from a ramp built of scrap lumber. "Just like him. Falls 15 feet, scrapes the muscles half off his ribs. Now he can't wait to go wog hunting." He turned to Betsy. "I've never understood about it. What's it supposed to be, anyway? A wolf or bear spirit of some kind?" "Nobody knows," Betsy replied. "To the Indians it was an earthbound spirit, tied to the swampland and surviving on sacrifices." Doc frowned. "Human sacrifices?" "Yes. Usually executed criminals." "What happened if it didn't get fed?" "It went hunting, I suppose." Betsy hesitated. "Or I sent someone else hunting. You're too young, Doc, to remember about the harbor boy." "Oh, I remember. How many people did he kill? 2 or 3? "7, said Betsy. "At least that I know of." "Good heavens." Doc looked at his cup of tea, then set it back on the table. "The first 4 were children," Betsy continued. "He was hardly more than a child himself at the time. He tied rocks to them and sank them into the swamp. With the last child, he had a change of heart and tried to bring her back up. There was too much mud and water in her lungs, and she died of suffocation by the time he got her back to town. I remember the day clearly. It was in the spring of '04. I was 8, you see, and the girl was my older sister, Nellie." Doc looked stricken. "Oh, Betsy, I'm so sorry." She nodded. "It was a very long time ago." He escaped when they tried to arrest him and killed 3 others, Frank Wills and 2 other men, out on that old road to the Bottoms. They wounded him badly, and he was lost in the swamp." The 3 of them sat in silence for a few minutes. "It's odd," Doc said at last. "Assembly is such a peaceful place. It's hard to believe that anything like that could have happened here." Liz Kendall took his cold cup of tea and emptied it into the sink, then poured him a fresh cup. "You know what my parents used to say when they first moved here?" she asked with half a smile. "They said it was a risky place, stretched between heaven and hell and ready to tip in either direction." Doc sighed. "All I can say is I hope heaven carries more weight." "So do I," Betsy gave a nod of assent. "But I'm afraid that may well depend on us." She hesitated. "And perhaps on Fletch." Doc glanced at Liz, then looked at Betsy. "You're sure about him? He'll be the next one?" "I'm almost positive, but Mark is dead set against it." "Who can blame him, Betsy?" Liz said. "Good God, it makes me think of that Shirley Jackson story." Betsy looked at her steadily. "It's necessary," she said simply. John the Conqueror. Susanna Nelms touched the beads of bone on her bracelet with a finger sticky from her afternoon popsicle. She was worried about Fletch. Daddy and Mommy were worried about Silver, but Susanna had the feeling Silver could pretty much take care of himself. Fletch needed someone to look after him. Whenever Susanna had a problem beyond her ability or understanding, she turned to 4-by Banks. Mommy and Daddy always listened, but sometimes they didn't take her seriously enough. 4-by always took her seriously. He would give her a popsicle or a cherry-flavored soft drink, and they would sit on the step of the barber shop and talk. If a customer was already in the barber's chair, she would have to wait, but if a customer arrived while they were on the step, the customer would have to wait. 4-by was never impatient, and he told her interesting stories about Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, or about John the Conqueror and Old Massa. "How do you know these stories?" Susanna asked him, shifting her foot on the sidewalk to make way for a passing beetle. "Well, the Brer Rabbit ones I get from Uncle Remus, but young John now, he tells me most of those stories himself." This made sense to Susanna. She could easily imagine John the Conqueror stopping by for a haircut and telling 4-by things to make him laugh. "You ask John for help sometimes, don't you? The way I ask you." "Sure do, honey. We all need someone we can go to when we run into something bigger than we can handle." "What does he look like? I've never seen him." "He's crafty, Miss Susanna. He can change his shape so you don't always recognize him. But mostly I think he looks like a young man. Has skin like bronze and hair as white as wool. He was a slave, you know, back in the day. But he'd been a king, too, some folks say. Prester John, they called him, a great king in Africa. And before that, I've heard it said he walked with the Lord Jesus in Galilee and learned the first of his tales from him." "Can he stop people from getting hurt?" Susanna asked. "And killed?" 4-by looked at her. He looked at the beetle making its way slowly along the sidewalk toward the street. "Bad stuff been happening," he said after a minute. "More bad stuff on the way. Don't you think you're too little of a girl to be worrying about all that?" Susanna simply shrugged. "All right, then, I'll tell you," 4-by said at last. "John, he can't stop people getting hurt or sick or killed. Not often, anyway. Couldn't stop it when he was a slave. Couldn't stop it even when he was a king. Child, the Lord Jesus himself couldn't stop things like that, though I'm sure he wished he could." 4-by sighed. "He's got his stories and he's got his tricks, but he gave up power a long time ago." "But can't he even protect people?" Like maybe from trolls and things? Sometimes I suppose he can. You're asking some pretty hard questions, darling, and I don't know the answers. Susanna grew quiet. Tell you what, if there's something you need John to help you with, I'll ask him. It's about time he and I had to talk anyway. What do you want me to tell him? Susanna spoke softly. Tell him I'm scared of the troll. I don't think she's nice, even though she pretends to be. And tell him to take care of Fletch. He's in trouble. How do you know that, child? Susanna looked up at him. Because Daddy says he's run away.